January 28, 1986. Kennedy Space Center, Florida. It is early morning at Launch Complex 39B. The Space Shuttle Challenger is scheduled for mission STS-51L. Overnight, temperatures dropped well below average for Central Florida. At sunrise, ground crews observe ice formation on parts of the launch structure. Some surfaces are coated with frost. Air temperature is measured at 36 degrees Fahrenheit, one of the coldest launch mornings in the shuttle program's history. Engineers and technicians continue standard pre-launch procedures. Ice inspection teams are dispatched. Weather conditions are reviewed. The launch has already been delayed multiple times over the previous days due to technical issues and scheduling conflicts. This morning's countdown proceeds within the established launch framework. Inside mission control, checklists are followed. Telemetry is monitored. Subsystems are verified. The shuttle stands fully assembled. The orbiter, the external fuel tank, and 2 solid rocket boosters. From the outside, the scene is orderly, procedural, routine. This is the 25th mission of the Space Shuttle program and the 10th flight of Challenger. For NASA, the shuttle is no longer experimental. It is operational. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, the countdown continues toward zero. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, the Space Shuttle Challenger lifts off from Launch Complex 39B. The ascent appears normal. The shuttle clears the launch tower. It rolls to its programmed heading. Mission Control receives nominal data. 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle breaks apart in midair. A rapidly expanding cloud forms above the Atlantic Ocean. The orbiter, external tank, and solid rocket boosters separate. Live television broadcasts capture the moment. At first, there is confusion. Within seconds, it becomes clear that the mission has been lost. All 7 crew members are killed. Launch operations are halted. Search and recovery efforts begin immediately. Across the United States and around the world, the reaction is immediate. Millions were watching the launch live, including school classrooms, as this mission carried the first civilian teacher into space. NASA suspends all shuttle flights. What had been presented as a routine mission suddenly becomes a national tragedy. Within hours, questions begin to surface. In the days following the disaster, the initial explanation focused on a technical failure, a malfunction, an unexpected breakdown. But as investigations progressed, a different picture began to emerge. The Challenger disaster was not caused by an unknown flaw. It was not the result of missing data, and it was not an unavoidable accident. The conditions that led to the loss of the shuttle were identified before launch. The risks were discussed, warnings were raised, concerns were formally communicated. The failure did not occur in the air. It occurred in the decision-making process. The catastrophe was the outcome of a choice made hours earlier, under pressure, within an organizational structure that had learned to treat risk as acceptable. To understand what happened to Challenger, the focus must shift away from the explosion itself and toward the decisions that allowed the launch to proceed. At the center of the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster was a small rubber component known as an O-ring. O-rings were used in the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. Each booster was built in segments. At the joints between those segments, O-rings were installed to create a tight seal. Their job was simple. When the rocket ignited, hot gases and pressure were supposed to push the O-ring outward, forcing it against the joint and sealing the gap instantly. If the seal held, hot gases stayed inside the booster. If it didn't, those gases could escape. The O-rings were made of a rubber-like material. That material behaved differently depending on temperature. In warm conditions, the O-rings were flexible. They compressed and rebounded quickly, forming a seal in time. In cold conditions, they became stiff. They responded more slowly. That delay mattered. On the morning of the Challenger launch, temperatures were far lower than any previous shuttle launch. Some O-rings were exposed to near-freezing conditions for hours before liftoff. This was not an unknown risk. Engineers working for Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the solid rocket boosters, had observed problems before. On earlier missions, O-rings showed signs of erosion. They had partially burned. They had allowed hot gases to pass before sealing fully. In some cases, the damage came close to complete failure. These incidents were documented. They were discussed internally. They were not theoretical. What had never happened before was launching in temperatures this low. No shuttle mission had ever tested whether the O-rings could seal properly under those conditions. By January 1986, engineers understood two things. First, the O-rings were vulnerable. Second, cold made that vulnerability worse. The question was no longer whether the risk existed. The question was whether it was acceptable to launch anyway. The concerns about the O-rings were not raised after the disaster. They were raised before the launch. On the evening of January 27, 1986, less than 12 hours before liftoff, engineers at Morton Thiokol requested an emergency teleconference with NASA. Among those engineers were Roger Boisjoli, Arnie Thompson, and Bob Ebeling. Their concern was specific. They warned that the O-rings could fail in cold temperatures, and that the forecast for the next morning was well outside the range of any previous launch. During the call, the engineers presented data from earlier missions. They showed instances of O-ring erosion. They highlighted flights where damage had already occurred at significantly warmer temperatures than those expected at launch. One chart compared temperature to O-ring damage. Another showed that the worst erosion had occurred on the coldest launches to date. Their conclusion was direct. They stated that launching under these conditions was unsafe. The engineers recommended that the launch be delayed until temperatures rose and further analysis could be completed. This was not a vague concern. It was a formal engineering recommendation, made verbally and supported by documented evidence. At one point during the discussion, Roger Boisjoli warned that proceeding could lead to a catastrophe of the highest order. The engineers were not asking for redesigns. They were not demanding program-wide changes. They were asking for time to wait for warmer conditions, time to reduce a known risk. From an engineering standpoint, the position was clear. Do not launch. That recommendation was recorded. It was heard. And it was understood. What happened next was not a failure to receive the warning. It was a decision about whether to follow it. The teleconference on January 27, 1986, connected engineers and managers at Morton Thiokol with officials from NASA. The purpose of the call was to decide whether the launch should proceed as scheduled. At the start of the discussion, Morton Thiokol's engineering team maintained their position. They advised against launch due to the low temperatures forecast for the following morning. NASA officials responded by questioning the recommendation. They asked whether the engineers could prove that the O-rings would fail at the expected temperatures. They pointed out that previous flights had experienced erosion without leading to catastrophic failure. They also raised concerns about schedule delays. The shuttle program was under pressure. The launch had already been postponed multiple times. The mission carried significant public attention. Further delays would have operational and political consequences. As the discussion continued, NASA requested data showing a clear temperature threshold, below which the boosters should not be launched. The engineers did not have such a definitive cutoff. What they had were warning signs, trends, and incomplete data, the kind common in real-world engineering decisions. At this point, Morton Thiokol management requested a private discussion, separate from NASA. During this internal meeting, the engineering recommendation was reconsidered. Management weighed the lack of absolute proof against the pressure to maintain the launch schedule. After the internal discussion concluded, Morton Thiokol rejoined the call. Their position had changed. The company no longer recommended delaying the launch. Instead, they informed NASA that they supported proceeding as planned. This reversal was documented. With the contractor's approval now in place, NASA accepted the recommendation. The launch was officially given a go. No new data had emerged. No additional tests were performed. No temperatures had changed. What changed was the decision. The decision to launch Challenger did not happen in isolation. It was shaped by a long-term organizational process known as normalization of deviance. This term describes what happens when deviations from expected performance do not immediately result in failure. When a system operates outside its design limits and nothing goes wrong, that deviation slowly becomes accepted as normal. In the Shuttle program, O-ring erosion had been observed before. Each time the shuttle flew and returned safely, that damage was reinterpreted, not as a warning, but as evidence that the system was still functioning. Risk was not eliminated. It was redefined. At the same time, the shuttle program was under growing pressure. The space shuttle was presented as a routine, reliable launch system. Flights were scheduled frequently. Delays attracted attention. Cancellations raised questions. Postponing a launch was no longer a neutral decision. It was seen as a failure to perform. Managers were expected to keep the program moving. Engineers were expected to justify stopping it. Over time, the burden of proof shifted. Instead of asking, "Is this launch safe?" the system began asking, "Can you prove that it is unsafe?" In that environment, uncertainty worked against caution. Incomplete data did not slow decisions down. It pushed them forward. The Challenger launch was approved, not because the risks were unknown, but because they had become familiar. The failure was not the result of one bad call. It was the outcome of a culture that had learned to live with warning signs. In the aftermath of the disaster, the U.S. government launched a formal investigation. President Ronald Reagan established the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident, commonly known as the Rogers Commission. Its mandate was clear: to determine why the shuttle was lost and whether the disaster could have been prevented. The commission included engineers, scientists, military leaders, and public officials. Among them was physicist Richard Feynman. Over several months, the commission reviewed documents, analyzed technical data, and took sworn testimony from NASA officials and contractors. The findings were unambiguous. The immediate physical cause of the accident was the failure of an O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster, which allowed hot gases to escape and damage the external fuel tank. But the commission made clear that the technical failure was only part of the story. It concluded that NASA's organizational structure and decision-making culture played a critical role. Communication between engineers and management had broken down. Known risks were not properly conveyed or acted upon. Richard Feynman demonstrated this publicly during a televised hearing. Using a simple glass of ice water, he showed how the O-ring material lost elasticity in cold temperatures. His point was not symbolic, it was practical. The behavior of the material was consistent with what engineers had warned about before the launch. In its final report, the commission stated that the disaster was the result of both a technical failure and a failure of management. NASA formally accepted these conclusions. The cause of the accident was no longer in dispute. Following the findings of the Rogers Commission, NASA suspended all space shuttle flights for nearly 3 years. Significant changes were introduced. The solid rocket boosters were redesigned, including a new joint design intended to prevent O-ring failure. NASA also restructured its internal safety oversight. An independent Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance was established, with direct reporting lines outside normal management chains. Launch decision processes were revised. Risk assessments were formalized. Communication protocols between engineers and managers were strengthened. Publicly, NASA acknowledged that the disaster was not simply a technical malfunction, but a failure of organizational judgment. The Challenger accident reshaped how risk was discussed inside the agency, at least on paper. 17 years later, in 2003, another shuttle was lost. Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry after damage sustained during launch. The investigation that followed identified a familiar pattern. Warning signs were again raised. Concerns were again normalized. Decision-making processes again failed to act on uncertainty. The technical causes were different. The organizational lessons were not. The loss of Challenger was not the result of a hidden flaw or an unforeseeable chain of events. The conditions were known. The risks were discussed. The warnings were documented. The catastrophe was preventable. What failed was not a single component, but the process that determined whether uncertainty should delay a launch. No single decision, on its own, appeared reckless. Taken together, those decisions carried consequences that could not be reversed. The Challenger disaster remains a case study not in engineering limits, but in how organizations respond when schedules, expectations, and incomplete information collide. When a decision must be made on time rather than on certainty, what level of risk becomes acceptable? And who ultimately bears the cost when that calculation is wrong?